The risk is now high enough, the threat is immediate enough. That's how U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan characterized a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration has not presented specific evidence of any imminent invasion and was clear that it does not know if one will happen. But with Russian troops wargaming within range of its smaller neighbor, Western allies are more concerned than ever that the window to attack is now.
More activity on all sides of the Ukraine crisis. Russia's Ministry of Defense released footage of Navy ships arriving in Sevastopol Bay on the Black Sea, in the Russian-annexed Crimean Peninsula. They're here taking part in large-scale landing drills. The situation makes many Ukrainians uneasy.
It's not a pleasant feeling, believe me, to understand that you encircled by the Russian troops from Belarus, 1,000 kilometers, more than 1,000 from the east. And last couple of days, Russia actually closed the entire Azov Sea and the part of the Black Sea, actually access for Ukrainian ports to the Black Sea.
The United States wants its citizens out of harm's way immediately. President Joe Biden has urged all Americans to leave Ukraine.
If a Russian attack on Ukraine proceeds, it is likely to begin with aerial bombing and missile attacks that could obviously kill civilians without regard to their nationality. A subsequent ground invasion would involve the onslaught of a massive force. With virtually no notice, communications to arrange a departure could be severed and commercial transit halted.
While civilians pack up, security forces are coming in the other direction. Around 1,000 U.S. soldiers arrived in Poland to add to the 4,000 service members already stationed there. And on Romania's Black Sea coast, a 1,000-strong strike force rolled in from a U.S. base in Germany. NATO's Secretary General was there when they arrived. He spoke of the importance of boots on the ground as a deterrent to Russia's military buildup, which he called unjustified.
So the combination of military buildup, threatening rhetoric, and a track record of using force against neighbors, of course, that's a reason for being seriously concerned and being vigilant and ready also to react if they once again use force against Ukraine.
Although the U.S. hasn't sent ground forces to Ukraine, it continues to supply weapons to the beleaguered country, part of a $200 million security package meant to keep this crisis from escalating into an outright conflict.
I'm joined now from Brussels by our NATO correspondent, Terry Schultz. Terry, the Biden White House seems to believe at this point that outright conflict is where this crisis is in fact heading. Are they sharing the intelligence behind their thinking with NATO allies?
They are, Michael, as they have throughout this crisis. Last night, NATO ambassadors met in an urgent session at 7 p.m., pretty unusual for a Friday night here in Brussels, and to share the details of what was coming out of Washington. And I think we need to be really careful to underscore that the White House isn't saying with 100% certainty that they believe Putin has made the decision to invade. But something happened yesterday that made clear to me, Michael, just how credibly allies are viewing these new assessments. And that is that until now, European governments and the European Union as a whole had resisted advising their nationals to leave Ukraine. The U.S. has been doing that for some time. But the EU said this is so damaging to Ukraine, it's terrible for the economy, it leaves Ukrainian citizens feeling like sitting ducks, and we just don't see a reason to do that at this point. Yesterday, that all changed, and European governments, one by one, started advising their nationals to get out of Ukraine. So that's something that has clearly changed. Now, the latest is that the U.S. is even evacuating its diplomatic staff from the embassy, yet another alarming sign. But I would also like to add that the EU ambassador to Ukraine, Matti Masikas, says it's fake news that he is leaving and he's staying put in Kyiv.
Though the signs are all there. We saw the NATO Secretary General in our report there, of course, welcoming U.S. troops to Romania. NATO is ratcheting up its military posture in allied countries that border Ukraine. How much concern is there that any Russian military action could spread beyond Ukraine's borders?
Well, there's a lot of concern because NATO is ratcheting up its forces in response to what Russia is doing. Russia has now sent more forces not just into Ukraine, but into Belarus. NATO says it's the highest level of military assets deployed in Belarus since the end of the Cold War, and that again borders NATO countries. So there is concern not just that the Kremlin may decide to come into NATO territory. That's a really big step, and one that no one is suggesting that Russia really is considering at this point. But even the instability and the uncertainty is a security problem for NATO allies and for Europe as a whole. So NATO is putting these forces there, putting more troops, more military assets to deter not just a Russian invasion into NATO territories, but to try to deal with the instability and the insecurity for NATO allies. That's NATO's job, to reassure its member countries.
That's Terry Schultz in Brussels. Thanks very much, Terry. And for the latest developments in the Ukraine, I am now joined by DW correspondent Matthias Berlinger in Kyiv. Matthias, for days now, the U.S. has been sounding the alarm that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could begin at any time, including during or immediately following the Beijing Winter Olympics. What's been the reaction to this warning in the capital?
Well, as you can imagine, people are taking this seriously. People are very worried about the future developments. People are also very worried about Western allies ramping up the situation or somehow adding fuel to the fire. But the overwhelming feeling is that there is something might really be happening, and people are getting prepared to it. We've also heard from official sources that the territorial defense forces, these volunteer brigades, have recruited a lot of new members. Many people have made the decision to join them. There is some kind of resolve to resist within parts of the population, and also the government has slowly shifted its tone. Before it has been downplaying the imminent risk. Now they're saying that there's always a risk. They're not sounding the same alarm as the Western allies, but that there's a shift in tone.
Matthias, as you well know, Washington has warned Americans in no uncertain terms to leave the country and is already preparing to evacuate its embassy in Kyiv. The vast majority of Ukrainians, of course, don't have that option. How are they reacting to this?
Well, they're staying behind. As you said, they don't have this option. And there are voices saying that they feel abandoned by the Western embassies evacuating their stuff so quickly. And also, of course, it adds to the feeling of alert that people are having here. There is no heavy criticism, but people are mentioning that they do not have this option. They will have to stay back.
A region continuing to be on edge there. DW correspondent Matthias Berlinger in Kyiv with the latest. Thank you.
Let's get more now, and for that I'm joined by Michael Kimmage. He was a State Department Russia-Ukraine analyst during the Obama administration and is now a history professor at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Kimmage, welcome back to DW. Good to see you. Even in these very pressing times, the rhetoric coming out of the White House from Blinken, Biden, Jake Sullivan, it's really quite urgent. What do you see as having actually changed recently that's been causing this very dire kind of statements?
Well, three things. You have intensification of the military buildup, including in the Black Sea, a sort of naval component to it, and that's really proceeding rapidly. Secondly, you have the failure, so to speak, of the diplomacy. It really hasn't yielded all that much. You had the collapse of talks between Ukraine and Russia yesterday on a resolution to the situation in eastern Ukraine. And thirdly, I'm presuming here the intelligence is pointing in the direction of an imminent invasion.
So let's come off the back of that third point. Presumably, the intelligence is pointing to that, but we haven't seen any evidence. Does the U.S. have a credibility problem when it's trying to press its case of urgency?
It may. Only time will tell, but you see that many foreign embassies are removing their staff. European Union, Israel, Netherlands, several other countries are removing their staff from Kyiv. So either they are following the lead of the U.S. or they are getting similar intelligence.
Sure. And aside from withdrawing personnel from embassies, what impact does this kind of talk coming from the White House, from the U.S. side, have on the course of events as Moscow might be hearing it?
Well, first, I think President Biden is trying to prepare the American and European population for what may be coming. On the other hand, you're seeing an intricate game where, by releasing this intelligence publicly, what I think the U.S. is trying to do is to preempt Russian actions or to prevent the possibility of a sort of false flag, a Russian scenario where they would cook up a cause to go to war and pin the blame on the Ukrainians. I think this is an attempt to get out ahead of that and to prevent that from happening.
Right. And just to be clear, not releasing intelligence, but certainly expressing deep concern about what they're seeing there. Are there risks here? Because you talk about this back and forth, this game that they're playing. Are there risks in how they're calibrating the kind of messages that they're sending out?
Well, one risk is that they may be getting fed a certain amount of misinformation from the Russian side. Again, only time would tell in that respect. And of course, if Russia doesn't make a move, I think that there'll be great anger on the part of the Ukrainian government, and exactly as you said a moment ago, would reflect very badly on the credibility of the U.S. voice in this crisis. But the signs on the ground do seem to be pointing in a rather ominous direction.
All right, we will wait and see. Of course, all of us are holding our breaths. Michael Kimmage, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.